Well, the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Nice to see you tonight. It's good to have it a little warmer today,
A little warmer.
a little warmer.
Warmer than Buffalo, anyway.
I can explain it to you.
Especially after
Really
the
cold
game.
up there.
Yeah, that was an easy game. Well, tonight, we're going back into chapter 11, and we're basically finished up with Solomon, and now we're going to look at what follows his son, Rehoboam, and then beyond. You've heard the expression, I'm sure, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, or we say, like father, like son. He's a chip off the block. In our bacon family, we talk about he's a slice off the old slab.
Oh, that's,
Is he a bloater? Yeah. But anyway, so we're gonna look at this generation change and what happened and the implications. And there's a lot of life lessons as we go into further into Rehoboam and then Jeroboam, who ends up as king of the northern tribes, and the consequences of Solomon's bad choices toward the end of his life, and the implications of it. So let's commit the evening and trust that the Lord will open our hearts and understanding. Father, that is our prayer, that you would enlighten, illuminate, Lord, our hearts and minds, our imaginations, to connect with what happened then, to see its importance and relevance to us as well. So we trust that your Spirit will enable our minds to focus and to learn and to grow as a result. So we commit the evening, pray for freedom and for being able to share with each other and to gain from each other as well. We ask for Jesus' sake. Amen.
Amen.
Well, we'll pick it up starting in verse what is it, 14, yeah. And so if someone could read from verse 14 down through 25, 14 through 25.
Okay.
Let's see what happens.
Sure, I missed last week.
Peter will do it.
Thank you, Larry. Then the Lord raised up against Solomon an adversary, Hadad the Edomite, from the royal line of Edom. Earlier, when David was fighting with Edom, Joab, the commander of the army, who had gone up to bury the dead, had struck down all the men in Edom. Joab and all the Israelites stayed there for 6 months, until they had destroyed all of the men in Edom. But Hadad, still only a boy, fled to Egypt with some Edomite officials who had served his father. They set out from Midian and went to Paran. Then, taking people from Paran with them, they went to Egypt, to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and gave Hadad a house and land and provided him with food. Pharaoh was so pleased with Hadad that he gave him a sister of his own wife, Queen Tahpenes, in marriage. The sister of Tahpenes bore him a son named Genubath, whom Tahpenes brought up in the royal palace. There, Genubath lived with Pharaoh's own children. I'm poking at these three names. While he was in Egypt, Hadad heard that David rested with his ancestors and that Joab, the commander of the army, was also dead. Then Hadad said to Pharaoh, "Let me go, that I may return to my own country." What you have lacked here that you want to go back to your own country?" Pharaoh asked. "What have you lacked here?" Okay. "Nothing," Hadad replied, "but do let me go." And God raised up against Solomon another adversary, Rezon, son of Eliada, who had fled from his master Hadadezer, king of Zobah. When David destroyed Zobah's army, Rezon gathered a band of men around him and became their leader. They went to Damascus, where they settled and took control. Rezon was Israel's adversary as long as Solomon lived. adding to the trouble caused by Hadad. So Rezon ruled in Aram and was hostile toward Israel. Boy, oh boy.
It was a different volume.
Yeah, right?
I didn't see a whole lot.
We give you
of
an
that.
A+ though for all that.
So, obviously, life didn't go swimmingly smooth following Solomon's demise. But what did you notice? What was going on here? What was the basic cause of these two people that are, one from the south and one from the north, that are described here as, in verse 14, then the Lord raised up against Solomon an adversary. And he says the same thing for his own.
Well, David conquered both of them at one point or another.
That's right.
So I guess they were going back for revenge against David's son.
But these are described in what way here in verse 14?
Adversaries?
Yeah. It says God raised up an adversary because of what Solomon did, his choices. Now, what is that about? Why would God do that?
The previous verse, he had promised that he would because of Solomon's heart had turned away. It says in verse 13, yet I will, it says not tear the kingdom from him.
Verse 9.
9, is that it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him.
Yeah, it goes on, although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's commandments.
Yeah, he made a big mistake.
And so, what was the result? What were some of the results of those choices that Solomon made?
He brought enemies against him.
How would you describe that if we were, what would you call that?
Payback.
But I think, so if he conquered the Edomites, which was, so they weren't Israelis, they were Edomites.
Right.
So they were kind of a foreign thing, so he almost had to treat them with some type of thing if they wanted to bring them under the fold, but he actually didn't. I mean, he basically slaughtered them all. So that to me is partly, not only did he not follow God's, the way he should have followed him in terms of the religious part, but that probably carried over to how he treated the Edomites. So that's part of why he got paid back.
The simple one was Solomon's heart was turned away from God to other gods.
Right. And he did not keep the Lord's commands.
Let's look at the root reason for that, it was all those women.
That's right. 200.
Yeah.
300 concubines, all these foreign women.
600.
600?
Well, here's 700.
Wait, here
That's
he
a lot.
is.
That's, enough to make him a shit man.
Yes.
It's like he removed his hedge of protection. He allowed the influx to come in.
So here we see divine discipline or divine judgment on Solomon and what followed. And it makes you realize sometimes my bad choices can really affect others in the future. Decisions I make have consequences. And we see this in David, remember? When David chose to grab Bathsheba for his own, and what followed after that? A lot- Yeah, children died, a lot of heartache. It undermined his confidence and his ability to, at times, to act as he should because of the guilt he faced. And then when you look at his four sons and what happened to them, and several died, and were killed, there was just a lot of heartache that followed. But here's Solomon again, going against God's clearly. I mean, it was so clear. I mean, over and over. How many times did the Lord appear to Solomon?
Twice.
Twice. And boy, if you had two visions of that, that nature, it would make you think twice about walking away from it, And yet he did over time, because he was anesthetized, I think, over time because of all these women and the power and so forth. And here he was, the wisest man in the world, and yet he didn't know how to apply it to his own life.
Is this Pharaoh the same Pharaoh that his wife was married to? His wife was the daughter of a Pharaoh, was it?
Yeah,
Or is that a
I'm
different
not 100%
timeframe?
sure, but I think so, yeah.
So, so she didn't have any influence
Yeah.
on this, what's going on here.
So it says he raised up against Solomon an adversary, and the first one is Hadad, and then it gives us a bit of background on Hadad, and what did you learn about Hadad from reading this? What is his story?
He was a royalty from Edom. He was from the royal line of Edom.
Right.
And apparently David's general, Joab, had roughed him up a bit.
Roughed him up, he
Yeah.
struck down all the men in Edom.
Yeah. More than roughing them up.
Yeah.
Sticking them all in the death camp.
And the Edomites are the descendants of Esau. right?
Esau, right.
Mhm.
And so there's been an adversarial role from the beginning. Jacob and Esau, brothers, you know, and Esau despised his birthright. And he went one way with his line, and they became lifelong, still today, adversaries.
Is that the
The
Muslims?
Arab-Israeli war really goes back that far.
Are they Muslim, the Muslim sect?
Well,
come?
that came many years later, but yeah.
Oh, okay, but that's
But the Arab, basically,
Arab, okay.
yeah.
Yeah, they're all basically distant relatives.
Yeah?
Right.
So what else is, to me is interesting is, you see these trips to Egypt, okay? Moses, you had, the Israelis were enslaved in Egypt, okay, for a period, and that was kind of, I guess, God setting them up for that, and then they came back. You had Joseph, with the coat of many colors,
Right.
got sent to Egypt and came back. So now you almost have these, I guess Esau's descendant, the Edomites, getting sent over to Egypt to, I don't know, it just, I don't know what the connection is, but it just seems like a pattern, you know?
Yeah. So what was the result of Hadad, and his posture towards Israel? What was the result of?
And he had a big grudge.
He heard Solomon was dead, he told the Pharaoh he wants to go back.
And we'll see as the story unfolds, he basically, because of his influence in Edom, between Jerusalem and the Red Sea, what was the pathway to that? What was the main route?
Oh, yeah, that's the one that goes through.
Sinai.
Pardon? Yeah, the
Sinai.
Sinai, but it was basically going through Edom.
Right.
So now, Edom becomes, instead of a vassal state as they were before, subject to, they become an adversary. So what are the implications for shipping and
Commerce.
merchant?
That'll shut that
Shut
right
down.
down.
Cut off, yeah.
Had a huge economic impact because that southern route was being shut down. And then we read about another adversary, and his name is Rezin, let's just call him Rezin.
Mhm.
And back in verse 23 through 25, someone read that again for us?
23.
Oh, 23, okay. And God raised up against Solomon another adversary, Rezon, son of Elada, who had fled from his master. Had Azazer, it was better when Vito was reading it. King of Zobah. He gathered men around him and became leader of a band of rebels. When David destroyed the forces of Zobah, the rebels went to Damascus, where they settled and took control. Rezon was Israel's adversary as long as Solomon lived, adding to the trouble caused by Hadad. So Rezon ruled in Aram and was hostile towards Israel.
So where is Haran? Where's Rezin and his,
Aram.
where
They're in Aram.
where is Haran?
Northeast.
Yeah, it's Syria, basically.
Yeah.
Damascus.
Damascus.
Yeah. And so, you see on the other ends, on the polar ends, the
It's
squeeze
basically
is coming.
surrounded.
What are the implications militarily as well as economically and so forth? If the northern routes they've lost control of that and lost control of the southern route.
Yeah, so they'll have two fronts if they have a war.
Yeah, yeah.
And they're squeezed in between.
They're squeezed in between. And this was part of God's judgment because of policies of Solomon and actions he took and choices he made. And they have a ripple effect, don't they? have you seen a ripple effect in your family history at any time? Choices made that took it one way instead of another? I'm not talking about your immediate children necessarily, but fathers, grandfathers, I don't know how far back you go. Hope not. Do we see it in our own country? Choices made?
Of course, Civil War.
You can see it today in Israel.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's still going on.
Still going on.
So,
Yep.
I'm sorry, you were.
Yeah, the other interesting thing is that they set up these marauding bands, so these are basically like guerrilla groups. No, not much different than what's kind of going on over there today.
Exactly, the Houthis, you know, attacking the shipping in the sea,
Right.
Gulf of Oman and so forth, yeah. And so, tension, trouble follows, a series of difficulties, putting the squeeze onto Israel. So now, Solomon's son, the rightful heir to his throne, is a man, as we'll see in a minute, a little bit later, his name is Rehoboam. But before Rehoboam actually is anointed and so forth, there's another adversary that's raised up. They don't know it at the time, but it's to become an adversary of Judah and Jerusalem. And it's going to be led by Jeroboam. And let's read that from verse 26 down through verse 40. You can share part of it if you don't want to try and pronounce all the names.
Yeah, I'll start taking this one. Also, Jeroboam, son of Nebat, rebelled against the king. He was one of Solomon's officials and an Ephraimite from Zeradah, and his mother was a widow named Zeruiah. Here is the account of how he rebelled against the king.
Okay, let me just add parenthetically. He's got adversaries north and south, and now internally, another adversary is coming up, this guy named Jeroboam. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, he's places a
He's an
mess.
Israeli.
Big bottle of wine.
Yeah, places a mess. Here's the account of how he rebelled against the king. Solomon had built the supporting terraces and had filled the gap in the wall of the city of David, his father. Now Jeroboam was a man of standing, and when Solomon saw how well the young man did his work, he put him in charge of the whole labor force of the house of Joseph. About that time, Jeroboam was going out of Jerusalem, and Ahijah, the prophet of Shiloh, met him in the way. It talks about the American Civil War there, Shiloh. And met him on the way wearing a new cloak. The two of them were alone out in the country, and Ahijah took hold of the new cloak he was wearing and tore it in 12 pieces. He said to Jeroboam, take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. But for the sake of my servant David, and in the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, you will have one tribe. I will do this because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of Moabites, and Moloch, the god of the Amorites, and have not walked in my ways, nor done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my statutes and the laws of David, Solomon's father did. But I will not take the whole kingdom out of Solomon's hand. I had made him ruler in all the days of his life for the sake of David my servant, whom I chose, and who observed my commandments and statutes. I will take the kingdom from his son's hand and give you 10 tribes. I will give one tribe to his son, that David my servant may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city where I chose to put my name. However, as for you, I will take you, and you will rule over all that your heart desires. You will be king over Israel. If you do whatever I command you, and if you do whatever I command you, and walk in my ways, and do what is right in my eyes, by keeping my statutes and commands, as David my servant did, I will be with you. I will build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David, and will give Israel to you. I will humble David's descendants because of this, but not forever. Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam fled to Egypt, to Shishak the king, and stayed there until Solomon's death.
Now, what questions does this raise for you, or what are your observations from
So who was getting the 10 tribes? Jeroboam?
Jeroboam?
He was getting the 10 of the tribes of Israel, and then the other 2 were,
Stay under Rehoboam, that was Solomon's son.
okay.
Yes, it was confusion because the two names are similar.
Oh, I see, okay, right.
Here what you have is, I don't know, if in a book or a movie scene, you have suddenly a current situation, and then you have a backstory of how it got to that 3 days earlier, you know. And this is to help us understand what God is gonna unfold in the next chapter, and why Rehoboam ends up losing it all. It wasn't an arbitrary decision. God knew what was in Rehoboam's heart and what he would do in his choices. But what do you find interesting about this choice of Rehoboam here, and what the promises that were made to him? Any observations?
Well, one is that God is faithful, and he did commit to David and Solomon that the kingdom would still be in his name, so he kept a portion of it to fulfill that promise.
He also segregated Judah because the promise was the line from Genesis 49 was going to come through Judah.
But why do you think God was creating a northern kingdom versus basically predicting a two-state nation? The northern kingdom, the 10 tribes, and then Judah and Simeon, which is basically absorbed into the tribe of Judah.
Yeah, and he gave Jeroboam a similar promise that he did to Solomon. If he follows his statutes, everything will be good, but if he breaks away, then he'll be trashed.
Well, didn't the northern part eventually become Samaria?
Yeah. That was their eventual capital.
Right.
Is Samaria. It went through, there were 4 different capitals over time, but yeah, go ahead.
Could it be that whenever there's a judgment, there's also a promise? I'm thinking back with Hagar, and, God was gonna take and make Ishmael into a nation. There's a judgment, but there's also a promise that goes with that. It's interesting.
I mean, to me, it's interesting. I mean, as we'll see in a little bit, Jeroboam, I'll be all right. Jeroboam wasn't a great leader, as we'll see in a minute. And it was sort of like God is looking ahead and knowing that this guy is gonna crash and burn, yet he still offers him, out of grace, all the promises that he made to David, conditioned upon Jeroboam's obedience and submission to the covenant that he had made.
But what's interesting is, we go back to when we talked about 1 Samuel, right?
Mhm.
At that time period, this area, they were dealing with a religious crisis, a political crisis, and a military crisis,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So we've seen it progress through all the times with building the temple to try to do the religious part. We saw like the warrior with David, and so they keep progressing all that kind of stuff. So now we're however many years later, and they wanted a king, like everybody else. They didn't want to have the old system
Right.
of, which they had with the religious leaders. So now it's a whole bunch of years later, so they've had a time to deal with this stuff. And they seem like they're totally focused on the political leadership and maybe the military side, and they're always losing track of the religious side.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think maybe God is trying to say, hey, you gotta get back to putting some more focus on that.
That's a good observation. Yeah, it's true that, in a sense, had Israel really, truly, from the beginning, been a totally united nation, the
No.
United States of Israel?
No.
No, the tribes were tribal all through the centuries. And even now, even under David, there was some measure of unification, and initially under Solomon. But as we can see, there's still all these tribal entities going on. And so, in a sense, when the 10 tribes broke away, the northern tribes broke away, that wasn't a big shock or surprise. And David did all he could to try and be the glue to hold it together, but it was always a challenge. So, in the last two verses, would someone read just 41 and 43, and then we'll look at, now we'll fast forward to Rehoboam and to see what happened to him, and then Jeroboam as a result. Someone read 41 to 43?
Now the rest of the acts of Solomon, and all that he did, and his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the acts of Solomon? And the time that Solomon reigned, Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. And Solomon slept with his fathers, and was buried in the city of David, his father. And Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his place.
Thank you, yeah.
Where-
Interesting, how long, yeah, go ahead.
Where is the Queen of Sheba in this equation? Does she have any army or,
No, she came up from, we're not sure exactly, from the Saudi Arabia, in that area. Could have been all the way down to Yemen, we're not sure
So
exactly.
she didn't really have a
But she was up
empire.
as a visitor, but she wasn't part of a military, well, there was economic alliance
Trade.
between the two,
Yeah.
exchange gifts, major gifts. But how long was Solomon's reign?
40 years.
How long was David's reign?
40 years?
Interesting.
40.
40 years in the desert.
Pardon?
40 years in the desert.
Yeah, 40.
Yeah, well, it's like, that's a magic number, right?
Yeah,
David's reign was split up though, wasn't it, so many years?
was, yeah, so many years when he was, before he went up to
Right.
Jerusalem, he was crowned. So now we move on. Interesting, it says, it talks about written in the book of the Annals of Solomon. Do we have any idea what this document was or where it is?
It's not the Songs of Solomon, is it?
No. We have that, but it's, no, we don't know. It's one of those documents that faded away into history. We don't have any extant versions of it. But it sounds like it was sort of a biography in more detail, I guess, of Solomon, what he did, what he accomplished, and so forth.
I've got a footnote that says, the book of the Acts of Solomon, presumably Royal Annals, was one of the sources used for Deuteronomic historians.
Solomon also wrote Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon.
Yeah.
He was a good writer, he
Yeah.
did some really good work.
Yeah.
He was wise.
Yeah. All that wisdom, it says all his wisdom, and yet, look what's happened because of bad choices. So now we jump into chapter 12 and see what the next generation looks like, for his son. We saw David and his sons, including Absalom and that disaster, and Anam, and now it comes to, and then Solomon, now finally here it's Solomon's son. So let's just read a section of this, and chapter 12, read 1 down through, well, let's down through 15, okay? If you want to split that up and read it, that's fine.
I'll start. Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all the Israelites had gone there to make him king. When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard this, he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon. He returned from Egypt. So they sent for Jeroboam, and the whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam and said to him, "Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you." Rehoboam answered, "Go away for 3 days and then come back to me." So the people went away. Then Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served his father Solomon during his lifetime. How would you advise me to answer these people, he asked. They replied, "If today you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants." Rehoboam rejected the advice of the elders, gave him and consulted the young men he had grown up with and were serving him. He asked them, "What is your advice? How should we answer the people? How should we answer these people who say to me, 'Lighten the yoke your father put on us'?" The young men who had grown up with him replied, "Tell these people who have said to you, 'Your father put a heavy yoke on us,' make our yoke lighter. Tell them, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips, I will scourge you with scorpions. Yeah, great guy, that's what else to take on this stuff.
Okay, so Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam the third day, as the king said, "Come to me again the third day." And the king answered the people harshly, forsaking the counsel that the old men had given him. He spoke to them according to the counsel of the young men, saying, "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions." So the king did not listen to the people, for it was a turn of affairs brought about by the Lord, that he might fulfill his word, which the Lord spoke by Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam and the son of Nebat.
So, what do we know about Rehoboam and his leadership style or
Yeah, he was a
management
jerk.
style?
He was more like Mussolini than Jefferson.
Took the wrong advice.
What pushed him, do you think, to act like, to respond this way?
Probably insecurity. You know, that's the mark of a leader who's not comfortable to lead, so he uses the whip instead of thinking.
Yeah, that's a good point.
He was gonna make a splash, right, on his own.
But it was also to a degree the will of the Lord that he act in that fashion. Because it says, so the king did not hearken to the people, for it was a turn of affairs brought about by the Lord, that he might fulfill his word.
Yeah. So this is part of the Lord's discipline or judgment on Solomon for his actions, and saying that because you didn't follow me and do what I ask, then there will be consequences, and now that's flowing forth. What kind of advice did he get? How did, compared the elders to the young guys around him?
Experience.
If he had listened to the elders, he would have had a much better reign, and the people would have been happy.
You can see these young, arrogant, entitled, rich kids, young men, thinking, throwing their weight around, and say, we don't, bunch of punks, don't listen to these elders. This is the way you run a country, And where did they get that? Where did that come from? That set of values or leadership values?
Was being raised in privilege, where they probably didn't work all that much in their lives, and they are taking advantage of those.
And in a sense, I think this was what was modeled in kings and royal families around all the other nations.
Right.
And how does that contrast with Jesus' leadership style, the model that he put on the disciples? How did he expect them to lead?
When Jesus walked on the stage being a servant.
Peacefully, peacemakers.
Servant leader.
Servant leaders, that's right. And Rehoboam just didn't grasp this, understand it, and as a result, he lost. He didn't know it at the point, and we'll see shortly, he fought to try and get it back, and it wasn't to be, because overshadowing all this is the sovereignty of God, allowing human choices to fulfill ultimately his purpose.
But he wasn't unique. If you look at history,
Yeah.
it's a history over time, people that try to use the heavy yoke, and those things have evaporated, yet the kingdom of Christ has lived for, what, 2,000 years, right?
I remember once a wise person said to me, Dan, when you are asking for advice, before you take it and implement it, consider carefully the source. Where is this advice coming from? Who's it coming from? And what's behind it? Consider the source. There's been other times when advice has been given to us in Scripture, and it didn't turn out so well because they didn't consider the source. Look at, for a minute, just a comparison at Joshua, chapter 9. Remember, Joshua was leading the Israelites into the promised land, chapter 9. And their brief was to destroy all the ites, the different residents of Palestine, and as part of God's ultimate judgment. We talked in detail about that last week. But there was one group of people called the Gibeonites, and if when you look in Joshua, this group suddenly turns up one day after the Israelites, Joshua and his armies had conquered quite a bit. But there was this group that came to him, the Gibeonites, and read verse 3 through 6.
However, when the people of Gibeon heard that Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they resorted to a ruse. They went as a delegation whose donkeys were loaded with worn-out sacks and old wineskins, cracked and mended. They put worn and patched sandals on their feet and wore old clothes. All the bread of their food supply was dry and moldy. Then they went to Joshua in the camp of Gilgal and said to him and the Israelites, "We have come from a distant country. Make a treaty with us." How far do you want me to go?
Yeah, keep going.
Okay. The Israelites said to the Hittites, "But perhaps you live near us, so how can we make a treaty with you?" "We are your servants," they said to Joshua. But Joshua asked, "Who are you and where you come from?" They answered, "Your servants have come from a very distant country because of the fame of the Lord your God. For we have heard reports of him and all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, Sihon king of Heshbon and Og king of Bashan, who reigned in Ashtaroth. And the elders and all those living in the country said to us, 'Take provisions for your journey. Go and meet them and say to them, "We are your servants, make a treaty with us." This bread of ours was warm when we packed it at home on the day we left to come to you, but now see how dry and moldy it is. And these wineskins that were filled were new, but see how cracked they are. And our clothes and sandals are worn out by the very long journey." The Israelites sampled the provisions, but did not inquire of the Lord. Then Joshua made a treaty of peace with them to let them live, and the leaders of the assembly ratified it by oath. 3 days after they made the treaty, the Gibeonites, the Israelites heard that they were neighbors living near them. So the Israelites set out on the third day, came to their cities, Gibeon, Kephira, Beeroth, and Kiriath Jearim. But the Israelites did not attack them because the leaders of the assembly had sworn an oath to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. The whole assembly grumbled against the leaders, but all the leaders answered, "We have given them an oath by the Lord, the God of Israel, and we cannot touch them now. This is what we will do to them. We will let them live so that the God's wrath will not fall on us for breaking the oath we swore to them." They continued, "Let them live, but let them be woodcutters and water carriers in the service of the whole assembly." So the leaders' promise to them was kept. Then Joshua summoned the Gibeonites and said, "Why did you deceive us by saying we live a long way from you? Well, actually you live near us. You are now under a curse. You will never be released from service as woodcutters and water carriers for the house of my God."
Okay, let's stop there. What's the key principle? What's the key takeaway from this whole episode?
Deception.
Seek guidance from the Lord.
You would say?
Deception. Joshua was duped by them.
Yeah, back in verse 14, it says, look good on the surface, this all look legit and so forth. It says the Israelites sampled their provisions, made sure that they were worn out as claimed, but they did not inquire of the Lord. And that's always stuck with me, that it's easy to look at a situation and say, this looks right, let's do it, And how often that can lead us down a path that can be harmful to ourselves and to others. They did not inquire of the Lord. And so this is, here's Rehoboam, you know, he's getting his advice purely from his peers. And he doesn't, no indication he went to the Lord and said, what do we do?
Well, but what's interesting though, if you look at the two situations, they didn't take out the advice, but the outcomes turn almost 180 degrees different. So in the case of Joshua, the fact that he didn't take the advice, but he kind of treated them in a good way, okay, at the end of the day, they were cursed, they had to become woodcutters and stuff, but they weren't,
Yeah.
like in the case of whatever the heck,
But-
Careful.
Jeroboam.
But down the road, interestingly, because of Joshua's inability to discern who these Gibeonites were, what were some of the long-term implications of those Gibeonites staying within Israel? Remember? Well, if you come down to Saul and David, they reappear and they
Oh,
become
yeah.
a source of complication. In fact, the Gibeonites are being attacked, and Saul even has to go and defend them at risk of loss of life and so forth, and a high price to pay to protect these Gibeonites when they shouldn't have been there to begin with.
Wasn't Saul, somebody there was from the Gibeonites too,
Yeah.
wasn't Saul, his mother or whatever, mother-in-law, somebody was a Gibeonite?
Yeah, and it goes right on down through history. So, yeah, that choice, that decision at that point had long-term implications. So,
If I could jump in here real quick, because
Sure.
I find it interesting that, you know, the Lord is letting Solomon have a kind of decision to make. You know, follow his path or not, and Solomon kind of went his own way. Now, his counsel, if you will, you know, understood the consequences of those acts and lived through the consequences of those acts. So when Jeroboam went to them and said, "What's your advice?" The advice of those elders, if you will, really kind of showed him the correct path to take. He chose not to take it. So it seems to me that the Lord is not going to direct you in one way. He's going to give you an opportunity to follow his path.
yeah.
But when you divert from that path, the consequences become
True,
significant.
that's good. Thank you, Chris. Yeah. So, here's Rehoboam, and he said, the young men who had grown up with him replied, these people have said to you, your father, you know, was really kind of a lightweight. You ain't seen nothing yet. And so arrogance and pride took over. And what was the end result? If you look down,
Civil War,
yeah.
with a rebellion between the two.
So
Israel and
let's read on from verse 16 down through 24. Some more.
All yours, Larry.
16, when all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, they answered the king, what share do we have in David? What share in, what part in David's, in Jesse's son? To your tent, O Israel, look after your own house, O David. So the Israelites went home. But as for the Israelites who were living in the towns of Judah, Rehoboam still ruled over them. King Rehoboam sent Adoniram, who was in charge of forced labor, but all Israel stoned him to death. King, okay, King sounds like he was unpopular. King Rehoboam, however, managed to get into his chariot and escape to Jerusalem. So Israel had been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. When all Israel heard that Jeroboam had turned, excuse me, they sent him, called him to the assembly, and made him king over all Israel. Only the tribe of Judah remained loyal to the house of David. When Rehoboam arrived in Jerusalem, he mustered the whole house of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 fighting men, to make war against the house of Israel, and to regain the kingdom for Rehoboam the son of Solomon. But the word of the Lord came to Shenaniah, the man of God. Say to Rehoboam, son of Solomon, king of Judah, to the whole house of Judah and Benjamin, and to the rest of the people, this is what the Lord says, do not go up to fight against your brothers, the Israelites. Go home, every one of you, for this is my doing. So they obeyed the word of the Lord and went home as the Lord had ordered.
So obviously dissatisfaction with the house of Judah and Jerusalem, and probably the policies of King Solomon, heavy taxation, being, what's the word, enlisted in work projects or forced into tasks and so forth that were difficult. The whole policy got to the point where there was major dissatisfaction in the northern kingdoms anyway, and this was sort of the final straw, when they came and they offered basically submission to Rehoboam, but Rehoboam, his terms were totally unacceptable, so they revolt. Isn't it interesting? Here we see God's overarching purpose, and yet it's human choices that are taking them there. Has anybody ever said to you, why in the world would God allow this?
Yeah, I've heard that a few times.
Oh, yeah.
Or you said it yourself.
Right.
In those hard places. How do we respond to that?
God gives us freedom of choice. We're not puppets
Yeah, we're
or
not
robots.
We're not robots yet.
Yeah.
Just give them some time.
I always think, he honors the decision of man. He allows man to make choices and do things. He respects that.
But at the same time, it says, but this was of the Lord.
Mhm.
So God isn't just simply a spectator. He's engaged and involved, and overall is working out a plan, as we'll see through the following centuries, leading up to the birth of Messiah through the tribe of Judah. But yeah, he does honor human choice, and yet he works in and through it to accomplish his purposes.
I've heard it said, correct me if I'm on the wrong track, that as soon as man addresses the 90% of the evil, man against man, God will take care of the other 10%. The natural
Oh, I see what you mean,
disasters and
yeah.
things like that.
Interesting.
But whenever anybody says, how does God allow this? Well, it's man doing it, perhaps, like you said earlier, defying God.
I mean, we want freedom, we want choice. I want what I want when I want it, and I want to know that I'm in control of my life in one sense. I'll do what pleases me, what I see and I want. And yet, on the other hand, when things go wrong,
You blame
then
God.
suddenly, why didn't you do this, God? Why didn't you step in?
How'd you let me do that?
Why did you let me do that? It's all your fault. Really? And so it's a paradox. God's sovereign plan and purposes, and yet human choices. And we can't fully put them all together at times. I mean, you just take one a natural disaster, a major typhoon that kills thousands of people, or an earthquake, or
Or a senseless car accident. I read in the paper today, there was a 15-year-old girl got killed out in Queens or Brooklyn because she was in a car and a guy was doing 360s. He lost control, killed himself and a 15-year-old girl. It's like you say to yourself, why does God allow this to happen? They made the decision to go in there and do that,
And so somehow we have to hold both of these truths in what I call a dynamic tension. Humanly speaking, we can't put it all together. But it clearly says, but this was of the Lord. And yet you see Rehoboam saying, in your dreams, am I gonna do this for you? It ain't happening. The tough guy, the autocrat. But at the same time, behind that, God is at work. So it's one of those things you have to live with. I mean, I don't know how many people said to our family after Sandy Hook shooting, why did God allow this? And that's an understandable question, but it's a tough one. why did my wife die of cancer? Or why did my children, you know, and so forth. It's interesting that, you know, it said, you know, God doesn't have grandchildren. What do we mean by that expression, by the way? Have you heard it?
I never have.
No,
Yeah.
God doesn't have grandchildren.
Well, we're all children of God, so.
Yeah, but just because your father or mother was a Christian, it doesn't mean automatically that you'll be a Christian and follow the Lord in every way. So each generation is at risk. We'll make choices. You know, we do what we can, train up a child in the way they should go, and when they are old, they shall not depart from it. Solomon said in one of these proverbs.
Yeah.
Should take his own advice.
So it's like,
Yeah. Do as I do, not as I say.
yeah, okay. All right, so he lacked the wisdom to make a wise choice here because I don't think God was in his thinking. God and his purpose, his sense of privilege came because of God's putting him in a place there and expecting that he would be the kind of leader and ruler and guide to his people as David was, most of the time.
I guess it kind of got watered down from David, who had to fight
Yeah,
to become king,
yeah,
to Solomon, a little less, or he got blessed with wisdom and many other things. So now, what does this leave for Rehoboam?
Right.
He's not, you know, I guess he's gonna fight again, and now this time he's not gonna win.
Was this, like Civil War or whatever, when they talked about Benjamin and Judah going against the house of Israel, was this, could also be a religious civil war? Because the new temple in that was moved to Jerusalem in Judah, and actually the name Israel means God of El, which was the Canaan god. So, you know, could this be something that, you know, might have been political, but also, as the tribes were coming together, that they didn't really all unite towards Jerusalem, but only Benjamin and Judah did? That could have been part of the driver towards the breakup.
and we won't have time tonight to continue reading on in this chapter, but as you'll see from verse 25 on, Jeroboam goes about setting up an alternative religious system in the north in
Okay.
order, because initially there was a real drain of godly people from the north going south, because they felt, you know, God had, that was where his presence was, the temple was, that's where God had established the kingdom. So he was afraid of if things stayed as they were, and that was a sin of worship, that people would drift away from his control. So he sets up a substitute or an alternative system with priests and God and idols and all the rest up north. And so there was, you're right, it was a religious as well as a political.
And before they established the temple in Jerusalem, wasn't it up?
It was up north, yeah.
It was up north.
And I think that people up north felt in a way like, why was it here and why is Jerusalem now suddenly becoming the capital? And
Right.
there's that tension there. Yeah, you're right, Ron.
I think that Jeroboam, instead of using priests, he used like political hacks. Anybody he had control over
Yeah.
to be a priest.
It's true, yeah. So in the midst of this, it says, he goes up with he sends up Adoniram, one of his managers, who was in charge of forced labor. I'm looking at verse 18. And what was the consequence of that?
Stoned to death.
Yeah, didn't work well.
Yeah, and in terms of results, it didn't turn out the way they hoped. And as even Rehoboam apparently was with him, and it says he barely escaped with his life. And that just shows how much tension there was between the north and the south even at this point. And so he comes back and it says, and in the meantime, it says, when all the Israelites in verse 20 heard that Jeroboam had returned, that is, he was back in the land, and he was a well-known figure. He had been part of David's management team, Solomon's management team, and was well-known and respected. And so they turned and made him king over the northern tribes of Israel. and then it says, only the tribe of Judah remained loyal to the house of David. And then when Rehoboam, in verse 21, comes back to Jerusalem, what was his response?
He wanted to go to war.
Yeah.
He gathered 100,000 men to go to war.
Yeah, 180,000 it says, yeah.
That's what-
And then this man named Shemaiah, we don't know anything about him, he just sort of pops up here. But what was his word of counsel to Rehoboam?
Hold on there.
Put your gun in your holster.
Yeah, right? Cool your jets.
Stand
Pull your
down.
jets, yeah.
Stand down, yeah. And to Rehoboam's credit, what was his response?
He agreed.
Yeah, he
So-
did stand down.
So you say this guy Shemaiah, there's no history of him and where he came from, where he went? Is he kinda like Melchizedek, who kinda like appeared and disappeared?
Well, you might make that comparison.
Yeah, right?
Melchizedek.
The man of God.
Yeah, but to me, what's amazing, now here's this guy who's, has the courage to be apolitical. I mean, he's standing between, guns are pointed, and he's standing in the middle here, as it were. And he has to deliver a message that may not be popular or desirable. And I think this is in a way, what we have to do in dealing with truth. Telling the truth may not be comfortable at times, or
Popular.
popular. And he was a patriotic Israelite, but he wasn't a patriot to the, it wasn't sort of Israel, Israel or,
It says he was a man of God.
he was a man of God.
We probably could see the big picture too.
Yeah. And so he took his stand and he said, no, this is what God says, even though it could have cost him.
Huh.
And I admire that kind of courage.
Peacemaker.
True prophet.
A true prophet, yeah, okay. All right, well, we'll pick it up next week from verse 25 and see the alternate system that he brought up. And then there's this fascinating story in chapter 13 that we'll get to. Lots more sex, violence, crime, it all comes in.
New lineup for ABC, I guess.